Rav Soloveitchik gives 3 reasons why we should still be saying those words of mourning and the talk about destruction today. And I have to admit that there have been years in my 40 years here in Israel, or precisely 39, there have been years when Tisha B'Av has rolled around and I've looked around and said, how can I say those words? We're prosperous, we're strong. I see, just as the prophet prophesied, old people and children playing in the streets of Jerusalem. This year it was not hard to say the keynote. This year it was not hard to talk about destruction. And I know I'm not alone. We find ourselves in a more precarious state, a more dangerous state perhaps, than we've been in a very long time. And I'd like to say that, Bret Stephens wrote in the New York Times yesterday that every fall begins with a lean. And no matter what your perspective on this politically, all of us in Israel are very tense, very divided, and worried, concerned. So let us hope that our prayers today, my prayers and all of Israel's prayers earlier today, and your prayers for the rest of today, will be answered and we'll find a way out of this. And halavai, that we should once again find it hard to say those words on Tisha B'Av. Okay, enough said. Let's begin. So the Rappaport Memorial, which is what we're going to see in a moment. The Rappaport Memorial was built in 1948 on the 5th anniversary of the Warsaw Ghetto uprising. There it is. And it's an iconic monument for the Shoah. Again, the first major memorial to the Shoah built anywhere in the world by a Warsaw Jew named Natan Rappaport. Can everybody hear me? Yes? Okay. Let's say because somebody is asking, is there sound on the program? Thank God that's one problem we haven't had yet. Okay. But there's a second side to the Rappaport Monument. Can we go to the next slide, Monica? On the other side, the less seen side very often, is this scene, which he called their final journey. And it shows the Jews being deported. We'll talk about that later, the Great Deportation from the Warsaw Ghetto. And you see them, they're all looking down, except for a few who we're not going to go into right now, but most of them are looking down. And there's a man with a beard in the middle holding a Sefer Torah. And it should remind you of something, of another work of art that was made about 1900 years before. And that work of art, of course, is the Arch of Titus. The Arch of Titus, which might appear on the next slide, I'm not sure. Monica, can you try the next slide? I tried, oh, there it is, the Arch of Titus. So here you see the Jews being led into captivity by the Romans after the conquest of Judea and the destruction of the temple. And you see them carrying the Klei Mikdash, right, the temple vessels, the chatzotzrot, the trumpets, the menorah, and you see also the Roman soldiers in the background carrying their banners, right to the right of the menorah. You see a Roman legion banner. So you see the soldiers, you see the Jews as slaves. Also, you see the same banner all the way on the left top corner, another banner. If we go back one slide, Monica, let's go back one slide. You can see here German soldiers with that very distinctive German helmet from World War II, that cover the ears. And you see they have bayonets in the background. And instead of the menorah and the trumpets, the man is carrying a Sefer Torah. Clearly, the fact that it's made in a bas-relief, just like the Arch of Titus, is meant to evoke in us that image that this too was a hurban. This was a destruction. And in fact, this is how the Jews in the late 40s and in the early 50s, when you read what Jews are writing, survivors and observers, for example, American Jews, when they write about the Shoah, they do not call it the Shoah. They do not call it the Holocaust. They call it the hurban, the destruction. Let's go back to that slide of the Arch of Titus. There was a first temple that was destroyed. There was a second temple destroyed. And now we have Hurban Europa. Now we have the destruction of European Jewry. In fact, that is what the first major academic work on the Shoah was called. It was called the destruction of the European Jews, because that's the term that was used. And it was meant to evoke the idea of the hurban that we mark today on Tisha B'Av. So let's give a little bit of context before we come to the actual destruction. The next slide, please, Monica. This is pre-war Poland in the red. And if we go to the next slide, this is the Great Synagogue of Warsaw, built in the 1870s. It was a monumental building. It was located right opposite the National Opera building. It was located in the heart of Warsaw. Look how tall it is. With that cupola on top, it was part of the skyline of the city. It was a statement of presence. It was a statement of a hope for permanence, even. The Jews actually used, they imported to build this, cedars from Lebanon, as if they were building a Beit HaMikdash. Of course, the shul was only in use for less than 60 years. But this reflects the fact that pre-war, Polish Jewry felt itself to be secure, certainly in the late 19th century. Let's go to the next slide. And here you can see a busy street, Nalewki Street, a busy commercial street in the most important Jewish neighborhood in Warsaw. In 1938, just before the war is about to begin. Next slide, please. When the war begins, the Jews are not immediately put into a ghetto. September 1st, 1939, the Germans invade Poland. They conquer Poland within a few weeks. The Soviets actually come in and take Eastern Poland as part of a secret pact that the Germans and the Russians had. However, the Jews are terrorized, and on Rosh Hashanah, 1940, they announced the Jews will all be moved into a quote-unquote Jewish residential quarter or Jewish residential district in Warsaw. And on Yom Kippur, 1940, the Nazis announced that it has to be done within 30 days. Certainly, some of Warsaw's Jews lived in that neighborhood already, but many had to move in. People had very little time. And the shock was compounded when, after the ghetto was established, a wall is beginning to be built by Jewish slave laborers around it to separate it more hermetically from the city. And this wall and the fact that the gates are guarded is going to lead to terrible starvation. The overcrowded conditions of Jews living in the Warsaw Ghetto were such that about 40% of the city, when you count all of the refugees that were brought in from surrounding towns, 40% of the city are living in 2.5% of the total area of the city. 40% of the population in 2.5% of the area of the city. People were living 5 or 6 to a room. We can only imagine what that meant for hygiene, what that meant for privacy, or the lack of it, what it meant for modesty. Obviously, the mortality rate is going to go up very quickly. Let's go to the next slide. We don't have to belabor this point, you know it. Go to the next slide. There were 50,000 children, by the way, in the ghetto, out of 450,000. After the Great Deportations of 1942 that will begin on Tisha B'Av, only 250 were still alive out of 50,000. We can go to the next slide. But there were people in the ghetto who worked to lift people's spirits, to give them a reason to go on. First of all, there were smugglers. Smugglers who, according to the documents we have from the ghetto, probably brought in about 80% of the food to the ghetto and kept most of the ghetto alive, even if on the brink of starvation. But there were also some spiritual heroes. One of them was the Aish Kodesh, the Piaseczna Rebbe, Rabbi Kalonymou Kalman Shapira, of distinguished Hasidic lineage. He was a direct descendant of Rabbi Elimelech of Lizhansk, who was one of the students of the Maggid of Mezerich, of Dov Ber. The Aish Kodesh gives drashot, despite the fact that he lost his wife, his son. He gives drashot to try to encourage Jews to live on, to continue the struggle, not to give up hope, not to give up faith. He gives his drashot every Shabbat afternoon between Mincha and Maariv. And after Havdalah, he sits and writes the notes of what he said. He calls it sermons, drashot, from Yemei Haza'am, from the days of rage. Today, it's been renamed the Aish Kodesh. And we have his sermons, the notes that he wrote afterwards. We have that book, and I'm sure some of you have seen it and read it and even studied it. Let's go on to the next slide. Adam Czerniakov. Adam Czerniakov is the head of the Judenrat, the Jewish council in the ghetto. And as such, he is literally stuck between a rock and a hard place. We have his diary. We know that he was trying to do what he could to help the Jews in the ghetto while having to listen to Nazi orders. This was an impossible task. Czerniakov was not a beloved man in the ghetto, Adarabba, despite the fact that medical clinics were set up and soup kitchens were set up. He was a hated person in the ghetto, as most of the leaders of the Judenrat were, whether they deserved it or not, and maybe they did deserve it. But it's the system the Nazis set up, so that the Jewish anger was directed not only at the Nazis, but also at their own leaders. Let's go to the next slide. Dr. Janusz Korczak, another hero of the ghetto. Dr. Janusz Korczak, who establishes an orphanage for Jewish children before the war, is a famous, not only pediatrician, but radio show host, giving advice to parents about how to raise children, a very progressive educator who believed that children had to be respected as human beings. They shouldn't be beaten. They should be allowed to fail. They were each an individual. These were very progressive ideas for early 20th century Poland, early 20th century anywhere, I think. And Korczak is so popular that he's asked by Catholics to establish a Catholic orphanage, which he does. When the ghetto was established in the fall of 1940, Korczak is offered opportunities to escape. He's a radio celebrity. He decides to go into the ghetto together with his orphans, his Jewish orphans. And he spends his time working tirelessly in the ghetto, raising funds to be able to give them food. Ultimately, when the Great Deportations begin on Tisha B'Av 1942, Korczak is going to go shortly thereafter with his orphans and march with them to Treblinka, to the Umshlagplatz, the gathering place, and then eventually to Treblinka. Let's go to the next slide. This is the Umshlagplatz. Beginning Tisha B'Av 1942, the Jews are gathered street by street, 5,000 or 6,000 a day, until Yom Kippur, a period of about 2 months in which the vast majority of the ghetto is sent to the death camp of Treblinka. Almost 300,000 Jews in a period of 2 months. There were 450,000 Jews in the ghetto at its height. And we believe that about 90 to 100,000 die in the ghetto, mostly starvation and disease, some certainly by shooting and in the uprising. But the remarkable thing is that after the ghetto is around now for a year and a half, from November 1940 until July 1942, 18 long months where every day is a struggle just to find food for yourself, for your spouse, for your child, for your elderly parent. 3/4 of the ghetto is still alive, even after 18 months in the ghetto. That's a testimony not only to the smuggling, but also to the cultural work that was being done, the spiritual work that was being done in order to raise people's spirits, the youth movements, the schools, the concerts, the lectures, giving people a reason to live. Suicide was almost unheard of in the Warsaw Ghetto. But beginning Tisha B'Av 1942, Jews are gathered in this Umshlagplatz, which in and of itself is a place of suffering in the heat of summer, to be sitting there for hours without water, and in the cold of winter, to be sitting there without any shelter, just for hours, until they're loaded onto the train. In the back is the SS building, which overlooked the Umshlagplatz. Let's go to the next slide, Monica. And this was their destination. Treblinka, a small village, about 80 miles from Warsaw. It was, on the one hand, isolated, desolate. On the other hand, it was just off a major railway line. Only a small railway spur of about 2 kilometers had to be built in order to bring the Jews straight into the camp. Let's go to the next slide. This is Treblinka after Operation Reinhar. Operation Reinhar was the German name for the campaign to destroy Polish Jewry, which took place in 1942 and early 43. And the Great Deportations from the Warsaw Ghetto are an important part of Operation Reinhar. The largest number of victims in Treblinka come from Warsaw. And this is afterwards, when there was what Rokhel Auerbakh called the Treblinka Gold Rush, when peasants from the nearby area after the war began to search for hidden Jewish gold in the soil of Treblinka. Next slide, please. This is the Treblinka Memorial today. Next slide. Emanuel Ringelblum. Emanuel Ringelblum is another one of the heroes of the ghetto. Born in 1900 in Buchach, a small shtetl in Galicia, southeastern Poland at the time. Emanuel Ringelblum becomes an historian, writes his PhD thesis about the history of the Jews of Warsaw. He is a member of the left Poalei Zion, meaning he's a socialist Zionist. And when the war begins, he begins to write a diary. But there were many diarists in the Warsaw Ghetto. And we have a number of the diaries because of Emanuel Ringelblum, because what he did was much more than write a diary. Ringelblum organized a group of about 60 men and women in a group that was called Einig Shabbos. And they began to chronicle everything that was happening in the ghetto. They began to collect the most mundane items, candy wrappers, report cards from underground schools, concert playbills. They also collected the diary of Adam Czerniakov, the drashot of the Piaseczna Rebbe, the Aish Kodesh, the minutes of the meetings of the Judenrat. And the reason they collect all of this is that they want to document what is happening to Polish Jewry from the Jewish side. Their greatest fear was that the Nazis would be victorious, which, by the way, is the way it looked to the rest of the world in 1940 and 41. Till the end of 42, certainly. It's only at the end of 42 that the Germans are defeated at El Alamein and at Stalingrad. Until then, it's a series of German victories, military victories. Their greatest fear was the Germans would win and the victor would tell the story. That was their deepest fear. And so therefore they collected everything to document what happened in the ghetto from the Jewish perspective. They also managed to smuggle out information to the BBC, which in December 1942 announced to the world that 700,000 Polish Jews had already been murdered. Let's go on to the next slide. This is where they met. The Einig Shabbos met every week on Shabbos afternoon in this building, which is the Jewish Historical Institute of Warsaw. It's a pre-war building, and it survived the war, one of the few buildings in the ghetto area that survived the war, although if you go inside, you'll see that the floor has burn marks from the time of the ghetto uprising. Next slide. They hid the documents, metal milk cans, tin boxes. You've seen these in the Holocaust Museum in Washington. You've seen these at Yad Vashem. They hide the documents when the great deportations begin. Tisha B'Av 1942. They begin to hide the documents then. They continue to write. They continue to collect documents, and they'll hide in a total of three different locations, tens of thousands of documents. And it's why we know so much about the Warsaw Ghetto, in addition, of course, to survivor testimony. Next, please. In 1946, an archaeological expedition tries to find the hidden documents. Warsaw is rubble, 80 to 90% destroyed. The ghetto area where the documents are hidden probably was between 90 and 100% destroyed. Of the 60 members of Einig Shabbos, only 3 survive. Fortunately, one of them is the man you see on the right in this picture, Hirsch Wasser, who knew the hiding place of the first treasure trove of documents. On his left is Rokhel Auerbakh, whom I mentioned before. She also was a member of Einig Shabbos and was also a survivor. The third survivor was Hirsch Wasser's wife, Bluma. And Hirsch Wasser himself survives almost miraculously. He survives because he's on a train to Treblinka, he jumps off. But jumping off a train didn't guarantee you survival. Most Jews who jumped off a train were probably killed, either by the Germans or by anti-Semitic Poles in the countryside. So it's only by the skin of his teeth that he survives and that we have this first batch of documents. The proportion of Jews murdered is revealed when you understand that 57 out of 60 members of Einig Shabbos were killed. 3 out of 60 survived, that's 5%, 95%. Let's go to the next slide. This is Rokhel Auerbakh. Rokhel Auerbakh runs a soup kitchen in the Warsaw Ghetto, and Emanuel Ringelblum asks her to join the group. And being in a soup kitchen, she's able to describe everything that's going on in the soup kitchen firsthand. How people who are here today are not tomorrow. How the one bowl of soup is sufficient to put off death, but not to prevent death by starvation. That it's a gradual process. Rokhel Auerbakh, as we mentioned, survives. She leaves Poland, as do most of the survivors after the war, in the wake of a series of pogroms. She makes her way to Palestine. And she works at Yad Vashem. She establishes at Yad Vashem the Department for Survivor Testimony. Really a continuation of her work that she was doing with Einik Shabbos. Next slide, please. This is the Warsaw Jewish Cemetery, and this is a brand new monument to the Einik Shabbos group, just put up a few months ago. And you'll notice the Ayin Shin, which is the abbreviation that the Einik Shabbos members used in describing their group, Einik Shabbos. And you see some of the names in front of us. And on the other side, there are more. Let's go to the next slide. And with this, we'll conclude. Israel Lichtenstein was one of the members of Einik Shabbos, and he's hiding the documents. So let's read what he writes, his last will and testament. With zeal and zest, I threw myself into the work to help assemble archive materials. I was entrusted to be the custodian. I hid the material. Besides me, no one knew. I confided only in my friend Hirsch Wasser, my superior. It is well hidden. Please God that it be preserved. That will be the finest and best that we achieved in the present gruesome time. I know that we will not endure. To survive and remain alive after such horrible murders and massacres is impossible. Therefore, I write this testament of mine. Perhaps I am not worthy of being remembered, but just for my grit in working with the Einik Shabbos Society and for being the most endangered because I hid the entire material. It would be a small thing to give my own head. I risked the head of my dear wife, Gela Sextine, and my treasure, my little daughter, Margalit. I don't want any gratitude, any monument, any praise. I want only a remembrance so that my family, brother and sister abroad, may know what has become of my remains. I want my wife to be remembered, Gela Sextine, artist, dozens of works, talented, didn't manage to exhibit, did not show in public. During the 3 years of war, worked among children as educator, teacher, made stage sets, costumes for the children's productions, received awards. Now, together with me, we are preparing to receive death. I want my little daughter to be remembered, Margalit, 20 months old today, has mastered Yiddish perfectly, speaks a pure Yiddish. At 9 months, began to speak Yiddish clearly. In intelligence, she is on a par with 3 or 4-year-old children. I don't want to brag about her. Witnesses to this who tell me about it are the teaching staff of the school at Novolipki 68. I am not sorry about my life and that of my wife, but I am sorry for the gifted little girl. She deserves to be remembered also. May we be the redeemers for all the rest of the Jews in the whole world. I believe in the survival of our people. Jews will not be annihilated. We, the Jews of Poland, Czechoslovakia, Lithuania, Latvia, are the scapegoat for all Israel in all the other lands. Dated July 31st, 1942. The 11th day of the resettlement action. Resettlement, he puts in quotes, because that's what Jews were told, they're being resettled in the East. And he writes under that, in reality, an annihilation action. Israel Lichtenstein says that he wanted only a remembrance for himself, for his wife, Gela Sextine, and for his daughter, Margalit. It is almost exactly 81 years to the day since he wrote this and put it in with the rest of the documents that he was hiding for the Einik Shabbos group. July 31st, today is July 27th. 81 years later, in Jerusalem, in New York, and in many other places, we are remembering Israel Lichtenstein. We grant him his last wish. And we remember also his wife, Gela Sexteen. And we remember also his daughter, Margalit. Thank you very much. Monica, you can end the screen share.
All right. Thank you, David, for an absolutely meaningful session. I'm going to turn it back over to Nathan now.
Thank you so much, David. No words to add. I did not see any questions in the chat function. If anyone has any questions, this would be a good time for you to put them in chat. Okay. Still not seeing any. So I guess with that, for those of us who are not in Israel, have a meaningful rest of the fast. We have recorded a session, so if afterwards you think any of your friends, family, whatever would benefit from watching this presentation, we'll share the link to the recording for everyone who registered, and for those of you in Lincoln Square, it will appear not necessarily this week's Ehad, but next week's Ehad newsletter. So with that, thank you very much.
Actually, very quickly, Nathan, oh my God, we do have one question that just came in. That's okay. One question came in just as you were speaking.
Go ahead.
So Anne Crane is asking, what does the new Jewish museum show about the Jewish community?
The new Jewish museum in Warsaw, called Polin, P-O-L-I-N, describes the 1,000-year history of the Jewish community in Poland, the largest Jewish community in the world for about 400 years. And from the medieval period through the contemporary period, including the Shoah. I see there are a couple of other questions. Obviously, the advantage of documents that are archival, that are written in the period, which are primary, are very different than memory. Of course, the memory of survivors is very important, but memory sometimes changes over time. Memory sometimes can even play tricks on us some of the time. So while that evidence is very important, the closer that it's written to the time that it happened, the more accurate a document can be considered. Of course, not every document is accurate, but there is an advantage to documents that are written exactly at the time or shortly afterwards, as opposed to 50 years later.
I've got a quick follow-up to that, and then a question from John. But Anne's question about the museum, the Polin Museum, does it show Poles having been a part of the genocide against the Jews?
It shows Poles in different categories. It shows them as rescuers. It shows them as murderers. And it shows them as indifferent. The museum has one exhibit that talks about dozens of towns where the Poles actually murdered the Jews and not the Germans. That doesn't mean that the Shoah was led by the Poles. It wasn't, but the Poles were directly responsible for the murder of thousands of Jews. As well as the murder of about another 1,000 Jews after the war. But in terms of the number, 3 million Polish Jews who were murdered, the vast majority are murdered by the Germans, often with complicity and help from the locals. Rabbi Soloveitchik, just to clarify, I didn't want to go into it in great depth, but Rabbi Soloveitchik gave 3 reasons why we ought to continue to say keynote and to mourn on Tisha B'Av. And if I'm not mistaken, one of them is that as Jews, we don't view things that happened in the past as only in the past. We relive the exodus from Egypt and slavery in Egypt at the Seder. We relive the giving of the Torah on Shavuot. We relive living in booths in the desert on Sukkot. And we relive also the destruction of the temple on Tisha B'Av. That's a Jewish understanding of history. We activate history in the present. He also mentions another reason, which is, I'm blanking right now, well, obviously that the Beit Mikdash has not been built is one, and there's another one too, and I'm sorry that I'm forgetting that.
All right, we've got more. I think now we have the floodgates. So Anne, thanks you for your response. A question from John Haderman. It's a question about the distinction between an archival document and a
Yes, I
memory.
mentioned that already.
Oh,
Yes, I
okay.
mentioned that.
So,
I know you're distracted, Monica. You're looking at the chat.
yeah, okay. So then you see the next question from Andrew about detail, how much information the United States had about the details of what was going on.
By the end of 1942, the Allied governments knew. That's very clear from the research. And they knew even before. The British had, through the Enigma project, broken the German code, and they were receiving the reports of the massacres of the Einsatzgruppen in the German invasion of the Soviet Union in the summer and fall of 1941. So certainly by 1942, the Allied governments all knew. The memorial is for the Jews. The present Polish government honors the Warsaw Ghetto uprising, as even the communist government did. And every April 19th, there's a major ceremony there with the highest government officials. And government officials from the West also come now that communism has fallen. The United States has sent secretaries of state, vice presidents, and even one president of the United States came on April 19th to the Natan Rappaport Monument for the ceremony commemorating the Warsaw Ghetto uprising. Yes, the Poles were also victims. The Polish government emphasizes that, and it's true. Somewhere between 2 and 3 million Polish Catholics were murdered by the Germans, as well as 3 million Polish Jews.
The only question we have is, Nathan, if you could introduce yourself in your role. I think for some folks who signed on a little bit later, they didn't get to know who you are. Can you tell us a little bit about how you helped make this happen today for everyone?
Oh, okay. So my name is Nathan Vogel. I'm a member of Lincoln Square Synagogue that's sponsoring today's program. And I'm the person who organizes Israeli-related programs on behalf of Lincoln Square. And those are our pleasure, but still very memorable to hear David's presentation this afternoon. So,
Nathan, I'd like to thank you and Lincoln Square Synagogue, not just for the initiative, but also for inviting Pardes alumni to join.
Of course. Of course.
Thank you. Just quickly to answer 2 more questions I see. The Jewish community of Poland today is very small. We don't know how many Jews living in Poland. It's probably at least 10,000, but the number may be much bigger than that. Especially after the fall of communism, many of them have discovered that they are from Jewish ancestry. The question of did people believe they were being resettled or killed is a $64 million question. We don't really know the answer. I'm sure that it varied from place to place, time to time. Remember that the Shoah goes on for 6 years.
I think people are.
So there are people who certainly believed that they were being resettled, and there's certainly people who may have believed they were being killed. But my guess is that even those who thought that they were going to die had some hope and doubts that perhaps they were going to be living. We have 2 of the 3 collections of Onyx Shabbos documents. The second one was found by a Polish construction crew in 1950, and the third has never been found. It might be under the Chinese embassy, but we don't know that for sure. Roberta Grossman did make a wonderful movie about Emanuel Ringelblum called Who Will Write Our History, and it's highly recommended. For some people, religious faith was a way to stay alive and to stay optimistic. And that's certainly remarkable and important, but I also don't want to overstate it. Many people lost their faith during the Shoah, and many people were no longer observant by 1939 among Polish Jews and certainly among West European Jews. My best wishes to you for a meaningful rest of the fast. May we know no further destructions. May we know celebrations aplenty.
Amen.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.